Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar on IR35. Are you ready? We're going to be exploring whether you really are ready, or hopefully address any concerns or confusion that you might have. So first of all, some introductions. I'm Sue Watson, the Head of Client Services at HR Solutions, and our main presenter today is going to be Victoria Templeton, one of our HR Knowledge Managers, who I'm sure you're all very familiar with now. We've also got Atim Arden in the background. She's providing any technical support. If you have any queries, do send them through to us. So we do encourage you to ask questions. We have put you all on mute because there's so many attending today. It would be impractical to let you all kind of have free for all. But we do want to hear your questions, and so you should have a chat panel that looks something like this. If you send them through and submit them, then we will monitor them as we go through, and then we'll ask them at the end of the session. If we have lots of questions and we don't get to answer them all, we will certainly respond to you directly afterwards. We are recording the session today, so you will receive a link to a copy of the recording of the webinar, as well as a copy of the handouts. As usual, we want to try and make this session as interactive as possible, so we will be running some polls throughout the session as well. When you see this on your screen, then that you know we'll be running a poll. Just make sure that when the poll screen appears that you don't put it into full screen mode, because it won't let you vote then, so leave it in the little pop-up screen that appears. So I'm now going to hand over to Victoria, who's going to take you through the rest of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue, and good morning, everybody. So let me take the screen. There we go. And
there we go. Perfect.
Brilliant. Thank you. So you should all be able to see my screen okay. So thank you for joining, everybody. And we're going to look at the forthcoming rule changes in regards to IR35. This morning. So I'm going to start with giving an overview of the IR35 before then clarifying who the new rules will apply to, explain why the employment status is so important, and then clarify responsibilities and what happens if IR35 applies. I'll then cover some of the potential implications of the rule changes before then providing a few tips on how you can prepare. We'll then close with any questions, and where we can provide clarity, we'll absolutely do that. Obviously, we're not tax experts, but obviously we'll do our best to help answer the questions from this morning's webinar. So we're going to just kick off the webinar actually by running a very quick poll. Sue, are you able to open up the poll for us?
Okay, yes, I'm just loading that up for you. Okay, let me just launch that for you. So, how many of you use contractors or self-employed people? Just to gauge. Well, I think that's fairly.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll close that poll.
Yeah.
And share the results with you.
So a very good proportion of you all.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So hopefully today will prove useful, and I guess the 11% that don't, perhaps you may in the future, and it'll help you in the decision making when you're at that point of deciding resource management. So I'm going to carry on with the slides, and now we're going to look at an overview of the IR35 regulations. So from the 6th of April, we're going to see the changes to the tax legislation that's regulating off payroll working, which is what we know as IR35. And the Finance Act of 2017 is going to introduce the new IR35 rules to the private sector. And as you may know, it is already in place for the public sector. It's been in there for 3 or 4 years. So what this will mean is that it will require contracts working through their own companies to be taxed at source. So just as if they would have been if engaged directly as an employee. Now these rules are actually to ensure that workers are broadly paying the same tax and national insurance as employees do. And the off-payroll working rules can also apply if a worker provides their services through an intermediary. So an intermediary will usually be the worker's own personal service company, known as a PSC, and they could also be a partnership, a managed service company, or an individual. The changes will mean that the responsibility for determining a worker's employment status will rest with the client, not the person providing the services. For small companies operating in the private sector, the rules are remaining as they are now, where the worker's intermediary is responsible in deciding the employment status and where the IR35 rules apply. So now we'll look at who they actually apply to, and determining the size of the organisation is going to be key, as it will ultimately determine who has responsibility to decide whether IR35 applies. So if two or more of the following rules apply to you, then the IR35 rules will apply from the 6th of April. And it'll either be the annual turnover of more than 10.2 million, balance sheet total of more than 5.1 million, or more than 50 employees. So if two or more of these apply, then it means IR35 applies. Therefore, it will not apply to the smallest 1.5 million organisations across the UK. And however, for associated companies, if the parent company of a group is classed as a medium or large organisation as the above, then their subsidiaries will also have to apply the IR35 rules. There is also a simplified test where the rules apply if an organisation's annual turnover is more than 10.2 million and is not a company, a limited liability partnership, an unregistered company, or an overseas company. So if using the simplified test above, then the rules apply from the start of the tax year following the end of the calendar year when the company meets the above conditions. So some people are starting to question, well, what if they don't meet the criteria now, but they may do in the future? Well, if a company doesn't meet the conditions on the 6th of April this year, but they are subsequently met for 2 consecutive years, then the date the rules are applied from is the start of the tax year, following the end of the filing period for the 2nd financial year when they met the conditions. So employment status is going to be important, which we're going to come on and have a look at. And it is important to recognise that the matter of employment status for tax purposes does not determine the employment status for employment law purposes. They're two separate matters. So if a worker comes under the IR35 rules, they will not automatically become an employee and be entitled to all the employment rights. The aim of the IR35 rules are to identify those workers who are disguised employees in organisations. Those working as genuine self-employed will not be affected by the rules. There is the employment status tool that's available, which the government have reviewed in readiness for the changes in April. And this status tool will help organisations to check employment status. But at the time of its launch, it did face criticism because of a lack of accuracy. Now, the question of employment status is notoriously difficult to determine within employment tribunals, as we know by case law, which is found on either side. But each case is going to be very much determined by its own facts. Therefore, it's questioned how the matter of status can actually be decided by an online questionnaire tool. You know, it's very much depending on the scenario and the circumstances, which I will come on to talk about shortly. But at this stage, in terms of the tool that the government have made available, our understanding is that following the review of the tool, the HMRC now does say clearly on the system that they will stand by the results that you get, unless, of course, the information given is inaccurate or deliberately non-compliant. So there's a little bit of reassurance there. But what happens if there are disagreements with the determination of employment status? Well, the HMRC guidelines state the client must consider reasons for the disagreement and decide whether to uphold or change the determination. The client must provide a response within 45 days of receiving a notification of the disagreement. During this timescale, the client must continue with the rules of the original determination. A failure to respond in the 45 days means the responsibility for tax and NI will become the client's responsibility. And of course, with anything work related, full and thorough records must be maintained throughout. They're going to be essential. So we're going to come on and now think about responsibilities. So the client, meaning the end user company who takes on the workers, is deemed as being responsible for the workers' tax and NI until they inform the worker and the person contracted, example the agency or PSC, with their determination and the reasons for it. The client is not responsible for deductions of student loans, holiday pay, statutory payments such as your sick pay, parental leave or auto-enrolment for pensions. Statutory payments and auto-enrolments will be dealt with through the intermediary. Therefore, it's the client who must decide the employment status of the worker. The client must complete a status determination statement, include the reasons and any fees paid, of whether the IR35 is applied or not, and the reasons for this determination to the worker and the person organisation they are contracted with. Now, if the worker is taken on through an agency, the agency must make the tax and NI deductions, even though the responsibility for determining this lies with the client. So what happens if IR35 applies? Well, the client or agency must deduct and pay tax and NI contributions to HMRC as follows. So by working out the value of the payment, deduct VAT, deduct direct costs of materials for the engagement, deduct expenses that would have been deductible from taxable earnings of an employee, calculate employment taxes and national insurance for the contract, and deduct the taxes and national insurance from payment to the worker's intermediary, pay employer national insurances and report these payments to HMRC through real-time information submission, indicating clearly that it is for an off-payroll worker. So there are going to be some implications of these new rules. So for those working through an intermediary, then with the IR35 changes, it will mean that they are up to 25% worse off. Contractors will need to decide whether it's financially worth continuing working in this way, or actually whether they choose to look elsewhere for work. They may feel disgruntled that they're being forced to pay the same amount of tax and national insurance as employees, but without any employment benefits such as your holiday, sick pay, etc. And they may also look to become a permanent employee of an organisation or provide their services to smaller organisations where they can determine their own status still. But what about the implications for organisations? Well, it will bring additional administration processes and costs, and large organisations may lose their skilled contractors because of the financial loss to them. Organisations may choose to continue working with the contractors, but now in an IR35 compliant way. And if IR35 is not found to apply to an engagement, it is advisable to review the contracts of engagement in place to ensure they indicate the working relationship is in fact a contract for services rather than a contract of employment. So to ensure you're working in an IR35 compliant way, then we would recommend that you ensure you have a contract for services in place. Engage on a project basis with fixed term durations and an end date rather than on an open-ended contract to provide services. Allowing and ensuring the contractor works for other organisations, and affording flexibility and control to the contractor to decide how and when the work is done. Now, control is one of the main principles in determining employment status, and control is about the extent of control the client has over what, how, when and where the worker completes the work. Accepting the contractor's right to provide a substitute, again, is really important because it's another one of the principles of determining employment status. And this is about a personal service by the worker required and whether or not that worker can send a substitute in their place. ensure the contractor uses their own equipment, and ensuring there is no mutuality of obligation. Now, this is a concept where the employer is obliged to offer work and the worker is obliged to accept it. So if it's going to be, it is going to be really important that through the use of contractors or freelancers, you do not have the mutuality of obligation here. Now, some large organisations have imposed a blanket ban on contractors to avoid IR35 altogether. So the organisation may choose to replace their contractors with permanent staff to reduce the risk of ending up on the wrong side of the legislation and therefore liable for non-compliance. This runs a risk of losing talent, but also increases costs, taking on the additional costs associated with employing individuals. So we're going to just come on to how to prepare for the change. So it is advisable to look at the current workforce to identify those who are engaged through agencies or other intermediaries, for example, those working through a PSC. Consider whether these current arrangements are still working for the business and whether they are going to be required to continue in this way. Determine if IR35 rules apply to these engagements. For example, using the government's checklist, it's called the Check Employment Status for Tax, abbreviated to CEST. And remember, determining employment status for tax purposes is not the same for employment rights purposes. Complete a status determination statement to give the outcome either way. And talk to contractors about the rules and what to expect, and ensure they are aware of this change in legislation and what it means to them and their engagements. Implement processes to determine if these rules apply to future engagements and who is responsible for making the determination for each agreement. Ensure that recruitment policies are also updated to reflect the new rules from April. And it's also going to be really important to raise awareness of this legislation among managers and anyone involved in the recruitment process to ensure it's taken into account when making resourcing decisions, such as, do you want to fill the vacancy with a fixed term employee, a self-employed specialist? You know, having an understanding of the IR35 rules will be key to your resourcing decisions. Provide training to those who will be responsible for making the status determination decisions to ensure they have the knowledge and capacity to make the correct determination. Now, there's a lot of information out there on the government website that can provide organisations with various support tools. So I've listed these here. So we will be sending a copy of the slides out to everybody after the webinar, and you'll have links to these. So there's information for private sector off-payroll working for clients. There's the off-payroll working detailed information guidance. There's the actual check, the employment status for tax check, which is the online tool. You then have an employment status manual and help and support for off-payroll working. And there's also material and guidance for off-payroll working for agencies. So hopefully that has given you an insight into the forthcoming IR35 changes from the 6th of April. We've got some time here for any questions, if anybody has raised any. So Sue, I don't know if we've had any.
We've had a few.
Okay, brilliant.
Just trying to filter through them now. I suggest we get through as many as we can in the next sort of 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to some of you directly. Some of the more technical ones we'll probably follow up directly afterwards.
Okay.
But we'll try and cover as many the themes kind of most of them today. If I can just say, so we've been asked a few times if there's a template for the status determination document that can be shared. I think the government doesn't actually produce one, does it? But it gives lots of guidance of what should be in it.
Yeah. So I'll perhaps find the relevant link if it's not on the ones that's on that previous slide. So yes, absolutely.
So yeah, that was just one. So we'll have a look at that. And we've also been asked to clarify the point you were talking about mutuality, about ensuring there's no mutuality of obligation. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yes. So now, parking the IR35 for a moment, mutuality of obligation is one of the core principles that go towards helping to identify whether somebody is a worker or employee. Now, what that means in practice is, so if you think about a traditional employment relationship between an employee and an employer, then there is that mutuality of obligation. So the employer is obliged to provide the work and to pay for that work, and the employee is obliged to carry out that work when they're obviously, you know, as per their contract of employment. Now, when you're dealing with workers, and in particular IR35, it's really important that you don't have that mutuality of obligation present, because that person providing the work should be able to provide their work to any other organization out there. You know, if they're truly, you know, self-employed and providing their services as a contractor, self-employed, then they should be able to work anywhere. So it's, and I suppose it links in quite closely with the control as well. The control is the other principle that helps with the defining of employment status, because it's, you know, going back to the true employer-employee relationship, then the employer has control over the work, and a standalone self-employed contractor should be, in practice, deciding what work they take on, what work they don't. So I hope that helps clarify further the mutuality of obligation.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great. So we've got some, I'm not sure how far we can help with these, but if a contractor is paid by another company or agency, but we get the invoice, do we need to do the CEST tool test? So I guess it's if you're invoiced by a contractor direct, but they're paid via an intermediary company or agency, do they still need to do the status determination, I guess, isn't it?
The responsibility still rests with the company taking on that worker, that
contracting company.
Contracting company.
Yeah.
So that the responsibility still rests there, but it's that agency that is responsible for processing.
That's all the processing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you probably need to do the tool, don't you, to go through this tool to establish if you are responsible for their IR35 declaration, isn't it? Or that they're, which in theory it would be no.
Yeah.
And then there's a further complication. If you contract work to a PCS and the PCS subcontracts it further, and they in turn invoice for the work carried out, do they need to do assessed for the subcontractor, the PCS, or both?
So you've got two other parties here.
Yeah. So it's a second generation subcontracting.
I'd have to look into that. I don't know offhand.
We'll come back to you direct on that one, because it does. I think it's also thinking it through. There's some logic needs to be thought through, probably not under the pressure of being on a webinar. So we'll come back directly to you on that one. And there's another one that's requested us to go back directly, and we're happy to do that.
Yeah.
Do you think secondments are caught by IR35?
Possibly. It's all going to come down to the circumstances, isn't it, in terms of
who's the
nature of
that
role and how that relationship's allowed to work in practice. I guess it's quite it depends very much on the circumstances, I would say.
Yeah.
But I guess
it will depend on the contractual relationship in the first place, won't it, with the secondment, as to who the employer is and who's and how it's engaged. So if you want to come back to us directly with some more information on that one, then we can explore it further with you outside of this. I think we need a bit more. So there is another question that's come in, and I think we've got an update on this morning. So what if they make a mistake when they're processing it, or if you know, the genuine mistake about all of this, because it's so confusing, isn't it?
Yeah, so ordinarily there are fines, but there's going to be a 12-month grace period. It's just recently been announced by the government, so there will be a 12-month grace period for any inaccuracies. Of course, if those accuracies are deliberate, then that's different, but literally for the first 12 months, any inaccuracies regarding the rules, you won't have to pay any penalties. So
Great.
that's literally
Yeah.
breaking news, isn't it? It's just what's being reported. So that's
exactly.
helpful for transitioning to this new way of working.
And when I carry out a status review, what should I consider?
Okay, so you'll need to establish the nature of the worker's job, and whether other workers who are employees are doing similar work under similar terms and conditions. I would say examine closely the period up to the take-on date, the start date, in terms of if the worker replaced another worker who was an employee, or was previously an employee and then became self-employed. I don't know if people are familiar with the Friday to Monday phrase, which is partly why these regulations have come in to avoid these situations. And the Friday to Monday phrase is all about somebody leaving their organisation on the Friday just to then turn up on the Monday doing the same activity but as self-employed. So it's really important to examine the history and how the work's come about, and I guess look at, you know, how it's come about, the suggestion, who it suggested it, and what kind of duties they're doing alongside other roles. So I think there's a lot to examine, and even though there might be a written agreement in place, it is always important to look at what's happening in practice in the relationship, because after all, that's going to be examined and scrutinised if it's ever challenged later on. So it's about the relationship in practice. And it ties in with the whole control, mutuality of obligation, etc., because it's really important to make sure you are working in line with those, whichever way you're going, whether you're going to be using self-contractors, then you want to steer away from that control and mutualization of obligation, etc. So it's a few things that you need to consider, but what's in practice is important.
Brill, thank you. And sort of linked with that, we've been asked, should the employer complete the test or should the contractor complete it and then submit it to the employer? And I think it is the onus is on the contracting company.
Yeah.
Hopefully not the employer.
Yeah.
to undertake, to make the decision, so they have to undertake the test and then complete the status determination. Is that right?
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, but of course then the contractor can challenge it, and there's that process of the 45 days, isn't there, that I talked about, where they can carry out a review of the decision. But yes, it rests with the client.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's all the questions that we can probably deal with here.
Okay.
So we will come back to some of the more complex ones separately. And so I'll give you some contact details as well if you want to come through outside of this, but you've still got time until the end of the webinar to just add any further questions that you've got.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So just want to enlist your help if we may. So we have a poll asking you to help us with some of the topics for our future webinars. So if I can just load that poll, and we've got some ideas. So if you can sort of indicate if any of these topics would be of interest to you, and you can tick more than one, and then we're sort of looking at how we might build our programme for April onwards. And as always, we want to kind of gear it towards what you are looking for, what you need, what you would like to see. This is really, really helpful, actually.
It is good.
Yeah. So I'll share with you, just out of interest for you. Oh, hang on, there's a few more coming in at the moment. I'll leave it a couple of minutes. I think almost everybody has voted now. Okay, I'll
That's
close
brilliant. Yeah.
that poll, just as I say, for interest for everybody. So the clear majority of people in the poll want to look at performance management, but there's pretty high interest for all of them. So that could have goes along how we're thinking.
And I suspect the performance management probably comes about, I think this is just a generalisation, but I wonder if it's to do with the whole working from home, because we get a lot of queries, don't we, around that, you know, because how can you actually assess performance when somebody is not in the same building as yourself? So I wonder if there's an element of that in there, but it's all interesting and all very very fairly high up there, aren't they, with the percentages?
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all for that. So we've just got one final poll, and it's basically just asking you if you would like us to follow up with you after the webinar on anything, on any of our services, our training, or any other topics. So again, you know, this is just to help us know who would like us to contact. Just collect a few more. Quite a lot coming in at the moment. And what we'll do is we'll just message you initially to explore specifically what you're looking for, especially if you've gone for the other option, and then we'll arrange a call with you to discuss it in detail to suit you at a time to suit you. Okay, I'll close that poll now. Thank you very much for that. That's the end of the polls. Just a quick reminder of our forthcoming webinars. We've got Health and Safety at Work one next week on safeguarding. Then we're continuing our SME challenge series following our SME survey that we did at the end of last year. So we're doing marketing this time, marketing to secure new business. Then we move on to absence management, and we're looking at mental health, but from a managing absence from an HR perspective. We did one last month from a health and safety perspective. We're looking at it from the HR perspective. And then we've slotted in a new one, which is now live. You can now register to attend that one, which is again part of our SME challenge series on managing cyber security. So it should be quite an interesting one, because we've got it from both somebody who's ex-police, so they have a lot of experience in dealing with cybercrime, and we've also got somebody who specifically looks at protecting businesses, so looking from an insurance perspective. And then finally, we've got another health and safety one, general fire safety, at the end of March, and then we're doing the data protection and GDPR, which is an extremely popular one at the moment, even already, and that one's not until April. So it's the new webinar program we're looking at building now, and your support today from that is really useful. Just to let you know, we do a whole range of services, including retained services, but also ad hoc support for those of you who are, experienced HR managers. We do lots of other bits and pieces to help you, because we know how busy you are. We've got a lot of free audits as well that you might be interested in. They're available on our main website as well as on our knowledge base for those of you who subscribe to that. and we can help with some resource planning if that's helped you. It's a detailed analysis of where you are, where you want to be, and a report that will help you sort of implement any process that you need to do. And finally, if you want to keep up to date with everything that's going on, we do a regular newsletter, it's a free weekly newsletter. Just sign up on the link there on our main website. As I said, if you've got any further questions, send them through to our inquiries, and they'll be directed to the appropriate people to support you. Your feedback is always welcome, and so please do let us know, so it helps us inform future webinars and events that we put on. Just remains for me to say thank you to Victoria for running a very informative webinar for us today, and thank you all for attending.
Yeah, thank you everybody.